It was a regular Thursday night. We were sitting around the dinner table, Emily across from me, tapping away on her phone while Molly cleared the dishes. The smell of baked chicken still hung in the air, mingling with the laughter of our kids. I was half listening to their banter, trying to ignore the stress from a long day at work. That's when it happened. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting some work email or a spam message, but my heart sank when I saw who it was. A message from Emily, our 12-year-old daughter, sitting right there at the table. My eyes flicked over to her, but she didn't look up. She just kept her eyes glued to her phone, her face expressionless. I unlocked my phone, my pulse quickening as I read her message. "Dad, I think Mom is cheating on you." I saw some messages. For a second, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I glanced up, trying to keep my face neutral. Molly had her back to us, rinsing plates at the sink, humming along to some song. Emily finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine, searching for a reaction. I forced a smile, hoping to shield her from the storm raging in my head. "Excuse me for a moment," I muttered, standing up abruptly. My legs felt like they were moving on autopilot as I headed toward the hallway bathroom, shutting the door behind me. I leaned against the sink, staring at myself in the mirror. My mind was racing. Emily, my sweet, innocent Emily, had seen something she should never have had to see. I wanted to scream, to punch something, but I held back. I needed to know more before I confronted Molly. With trembling hands, I typed back, "What did you see?" The reply came almost immediately. I saw her texting with Oliver, her trainer. They were talking about meeting up, saying they missed each other. It didn't sound like just friends. Oliver. The name hit me like a freight train. I'd met him a few times at the gym, one of those too handsome for his own good types. I'd brushed off his familiarity with Molly, chalking it up to her enthusiasm for fitness. Now, the pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I clenched my jaw, trying to swallow down the wave of anger and betrayal threatening to overwhelm me. I needed to stay calm, to think this through. If I flew off the handle now, Molly would just deny it and cover her tracks. No, I needed proof. I needed to catch them in the act. Taking a deep breath, I straightened up and opened the bathroom door, walking back into the dining room. Molly glanced over her shoulder, flashing me a smile. "Everything okay?" she asked, all innocence and light. "Yeah, just had to wash up," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal. I could feel Emily's eyes on me, full of questions I didn't have answers to yet. "Great," Molly chirped, turning back to the sink. "Can you get the kids ready for bed?" "Sure," I said, though my mind was a million miles away. Tonight wasn't the time for confrontation. Tonight was the time for planning. I had to be smart about this if I wanted to make them both pay for what they'd done. As I helped Emily and our youngest get ready for bed, my mind spun with plans. Tomorrow, when Molly was at her yoga class, I'd go through her laptop, her emails, and her messages. I'd get all the evidence I needed. And then, I'd make my move. But for now, I had to act like everything was fine, like my world hadn't just been turned upside down. I tucked Emily in, giving her a kiss on the forehead. "We'll talk more tomorrow," I whispered, and she nodded, a worried frown creasing her little face. I stood up, my heart hardening. If Molly thought she could get away with this, she had another thing coming. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache, the weight of Emily's message still pressing down on me. I glanced over at Molly, sleeping peacefully beside me, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. How could she lie there so calmly, knowing what she was doing behind my back? I had to bite down on the anger and swallow it whole. Not yet. The time for revenge would come. But I needed more than just suspicion. I needed undeniable proof. Molly stirred, stretching out like a cat, before rolling over to face me. "Morning," she murmured with a smile, her eyes half closed. "You okay? You seem off." "Just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. "Rough night's sleep." She gave me a quick peck on the cheek and got out of bed. "Well, I'm heading to yoga soon. You want to come with me to the gym afterward?" I shook my head, keeping my expression neutral. "Nah, I've got some work to catch up on." "Alright, suit yourself." She shrugged, completely unbothered as she went to get ready. I watched her disappear into the bathroom, my stomach twisting with a mix of rage and disgust. As soon as I heard the shower start, I sprang into action. I grabbed the family laptop from the study and sat down at the dining room table. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it up and logged into Molly's email. She had given me the password ages ago, back when we trusted each other. Funny how things change. I started sifting through her emails, scrolling past the usual spam, newsletters, and work correspondence. Nothing suspicious. Then I checked her social media accounts, still nothing out of the ordinary. Was Emily wrong? Had I been jumping to conclusions? Then I thought of the one place I hadn't checked, her messaging app. My heart pounded as I clicked it open, navigating to her chat history. And there it was, a thread with Oliver. My blood ran cold as I clicked on it, and the conversation loaded on the screen. Can't wait to see you today. Missed you so much. Me too. Last night was incredible. Wish we could have more time like that. My grip tightened on the laptop, the words blurring as a hot wave of anger washed over me. I forced myself to keep reading, each message like a stab to the chest. There were dozens of them, some innocuous, others so brazenly intimate that I wanted to throw the laptop across the room. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I needed this evidence. I quickly scrolled through the messages, taking screenshots of the worst ones, the ones that would be impossible to explain away. As I saved each one, I felt a grim satisfaction building inside me. She thought she was so clever, so sneaky, but I had her now. I checked the time. Molly would be out of the shower soon. I had to move fast. I went through her messages systematically, saving every piece of evidence that could expose their affair. Texts, photos, even details about where they'd meet up. I sent them all to my private email account for safekeeping. Just as I closed the laptop, I heard the bathroom door open. Molly walked out, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping. "What are you doing?" she asked casually, drying her hair with another towel. "Just catching up on some work emails," I replied, my voice steady, betraying nothing. I forced myself to look at her, to act like everything was normal. "You heading out soon?" "Yeah, just need to get dressed," she said, flashing me a quick smile before heading back into the bedroom. I watched her go, my jaw clenching. If only she knew what was coming. But not yet. I had a plan, and it would all come together soon. I just needed to make sure every piece was in place. Once Molly left for yoga, I sat back down at the table, my head spinning. I had the evidence. Now, I needed to figure out the next step. That's when the idea hit me. Our son's birthday party was next week. Everyone would be there, family, friends, neighbors. The perfect opportunity to expose her and that scumbag Oliver for what they were. But before that, I needed to dig deeper. I had to make sure my revenge was thorough, and that I left no room for excuses or denials. I picked up my phone and dialed a number, my old friend Mike, who worked at the gym where Oliver trained. If there was any dirt on this guy, Mike would know. "Hey, man, what's up?" Mike answered, his voice casual. "Not much," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Actually, I need a favor. Do you know that trainer, Oliver? Can you tell me a bit about him?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oliver? Yeah, I know him. Why? Something up?" "Let's just say I'm doing some background research," I said, choosing my words carefully. Mike let out a low whistle. "Sounds serious. All right, I'll see what I can find out for you. Just give me a bit." "Appreciate it," I said, hanging up. I put the phone down, a grim smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Now it was just a matter of time. As I sat there, I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock, each second a countdown to the moment I would set my plan into motion. I glanced out the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The storm was coming, but I was ready for it. The week leading up to the party felt like walking through a minefield. Every time Molly smiled at me or casually mentioned her plans for the day, I had to force down the rising bile in my throat. I played the part of the loving husband well, hiding my disgust and rage behind an impenetrable mask. It wasn't easy, but the thought of what was to come kept me focused. I kept busy, preparing for our son's birthday party as if nothing was amiss. Invitations were sent, food was ordered, and the backyard was set up for a festive celebration. Molly seemed pleased by my sudden burst of enthusiasm, probably thinking I was trying to be a more involved dad. She had no idea what I was really up to. Meanwhile, I was gathering the final pieces of my plan. Mike came through for me, as I knew he would. He called a couple of days after I'd asked him about Oliver. "Listen, man," he said, his voice low and cautious, "I did some digging. Turns out Oliver's got a bit of a reputation at the gym. He's known for getting too close to his female clients. Management has had complaints before, but nothing ever stuck. He's a smooth talker, you know? I clenched my jaw, the anger bubbling up again. That's exactly what I needed to know. Thanks, Mike. No problem, he replied. Just be careful with whatever you're planning. This could get messy. It's already messy, I muttered before hanging up. With Mike's information in my pocket, I reached out to the gym's management anonymously. I sent them some of the screenshots I had gathered, evidence of Oliver's unprofessional conduct with Molly. I knew they wouldn't ignore something this concrete, especially with his history of complaints. If everything went according to plan, Oliver's days at the gym were numbered. By Thursday, 2 days before the party, I had everything ready. I printed out the most damning screenshots and placed them in a folder. I also created a slideshow on my laptop, a little presentation for the party. It was dark and cruel, but I needed to make sure everyone there understood the full extent of Molly and Oliver's betrayal. I wanted them both to be utterly exposed, with no room left for doubt or excuses. The morning of the party arrived, sunny and cheerful as if mocking the storm brewing inside me. Molly was buzzing around the house, setting up decorations, making sure everything was perfect. I watched her silently from the kitchen, sipping my coffee. She looked happy and relaxed, like a woman who had everything in control. She was so confident in her lies, so secure in the web of deception she had spun. I couldn't wait to rip it all apart. Hey, can you help me set up the tables outside? Molly called out to me, flashing a bright smile. I think we might need an extra one for all the food. Sure, I replied, returning her smile with one of my own. Anything for our son's big day. She beamed, oblivious to the double meaning behind my words, and turned back to arranging the balloons. I followed her outside, my heart pounding with anticipation. Just a few more hours now. Guests began to arrive around noon. Friends, family, neighbors, all gathered to celebrate our son's birthday. The backyard was filled with laughter, kids running around, and adults mingling over drinks. I played the part of the gracious host, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and keeping up the facade. Molly was in her element, chatting with guests, laughing as if she didn't have a care in the world. I kept my eye on her, waiting for the right moment. And then, he showed up. Oliver strolled into the yard, carrying a gift, smiling like he belonged there. I had to dig my nails into my palm to keep from lunging at him. He greeted Molly with a hug that lasted just a second too long, her smile a bit too warm. A few guests noticed, glancing at me to gauge my reaction. I gave them nothing, just a nod and a tight-lipped smile. The afternoon dragged on, every second building the tension in my chest. Finally, when everyone was gathered around the table for cake and presents, I knew it was time. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and clinked my fork against my glass. Excuse me, everyone, I called out, my voice strong and calm. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned to me. Before we get to the cake, I just wanted to say a few words. Molly looked at me, her smile a bit puzzled but still warm. Oliver stood off to the side, his expression casual. Clueless about what was coming. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about family, trust, and honesty, I began, my gaze shifting toward Molly. Her smile faltered slightly. You see, sometimes, people you trust most are the ones who betray you the deepest. A murmur ran through the crowd. Molly's eyes widened, confusion giving way to a flicker of fear. I pulled out the folder and held it up. In light of those values, I thought it was only fair to share something with all of you. I said, my voice growing colder. I opened the folder, revealing the printed screenshots, and began passing them around to the nearest guests. These are some messages between my wife, Molly, and her personal trainer, Oliver. Gasps filled the air. People snatched at the papers, their eyes scanning the messages with a mix of disbelief and shock. Molly's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Oliver's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of panic. This isn't just some mistake, I continued, my eyes boring into Molly's. This has been going on for months. And I thought it was only right to make sure everyone knew the truth. Molly stumbled forward, reaching for me. Thomas, please, don't, I snapped, stepping back. You've said enough. I turned to Oliver, whose face was now a sickly shade of pale. Oh, and Oliver, you might want to check in with your employer. I had a little chat with them about your conduct. I don't think you'll be working as a trainer anymore. His eyes widened, the reality crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He turned and bolted toward the gate, shoving past guests as he fled the scene. Molly stood there, surrounded by the judgmental stares of our friends and family, tears streaming down her face. I looked around, taking in the scene, feeling a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. I had exposed them and made them both pay for their betrayal. Now, there was just one last thing to do. I turned to our guests, my expression calm. The party is over. I'll be taking my kids now, and we'll be moving on with our lives. As for Molly, I glanced at her one last time, her face twisted in anguish. She'll have to figure out her own way forward. And with that, I walked inside to get our children, leaving Molly standing alone in the middle of the wreckage she had caused. The days after the party felt like emerging from the eye of a hurricane, only to be thrown into its violent outer bands. I stayed focused, moving through the motions mechanically. The first thing I did was pack our essentials. I moved quickly, driven by adrenaline and a relentless sense of purpose. I didn't give myself time to think or second guess. Molly tried to talk to me as I packed, her voice raw from crying. "Thomas, we need to talk. Please, just hear me out." I ignored her, zipped up the suitcases, and headed to the kids' rooms. Our son was old enough to sense that something was wrong, and his wide eyes followed me as I gathered his things. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, his voice quivering. I forced a smile. "We're going on a little trip, buddy. Just you, me, and your sister." He glanced toward the door where Molly stood, her face pale and tear-streaked. "What about Mom?" I crouched down in front of him, feeling the weight of my words pressing down like a ton of bricks. "Mom needs some time to think. But don't worry, we'll see her again soon." It was a half-truth, and it tasted bitter on my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to explain the full reality of our situation to him. Not yet. I didn't make eye contact with Molly as I guided the kids past her, heading toward the car. "Thomas, please," she choked out, but I kept walking. I couldn't listen to her pleas. The sound of her voice only fueled the anger that still simmered inside me. By the time we drove away, my stomach was in knots. My son sat silently in the backseat, staring out the window, while my daughter played with a stuffed toy, blissfully unaware of the chaos. I had to stay strong for them. I had made a decision. And there was no turning back. We checked into a small hotel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was clean, and most importantly, it put some distance between us and Molly. As I sat on the edge of the bed that night, I felt the crushing weight of what had just happened. The anger and adrenaline that had propelled me forward began to dissipate, leaving behind a hollow ache. I glanced at my phone, which I had put on silent. There were over a dozen missed calls and messages from Molly. But I couldn't bring myself to look at them. Instead, I texted my lawyer to set up a meeting the next day. This was going to get messy, and I needed to be prepared. The next morning, I dropped the kids off with my parents. I couldn't bear to take them to Molly's place, not with everything still so raw. My mom gave me a look of deep concern but didn't press for details. "You do what you need to do," she said quietly, hugging me before I left. I met with my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, who listened as I laid out the situation. She nodded thoughtfully, taking notes as I spoke. "It's clear-cut," she said when I finished. "Given the evidence and the public nature of what happened, we have a strong case for custody." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "What about the house?" "That's trickier," she admitted. "Molly has rights, too. But if we push the infidelity angle and the fallout from her affair, we might be able to negotiate something favorable. The main priority right now is the kids." I agreed, signing the necessary papers. As I left her office, I felt a surge of grim determination. I was doing this for my children, to give them a stable life. Molly had made her choices, now she would face the consequences. Over the next few weeks, the fallout of the party became the talk of the town. People who had been at the party spread the word, and soon everyone knew about Molly's affair with Oliver. The whispers and judgment reached her workplace, and she took a leave of absence. Unable to face her colleagues. She was trapped in a storm of her own making, and it was brutal to watch, even from a distance. As for Oliver, he was fired from the gym. The management didn't take kindly to the evidence I had provided, especially since it wasn't the first complaint about his inappropriate behavior. Without his job, his reputation in the fitness community was shot. He tried to defend himself, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but nobody believed him. He had burned too many bridges. And this scandal was the final nail in his professional coffin. Molly called and texted constantly, alternating between begging for forgiveness and lashing out in anger. I ignored most of her messages, only replying to those that involved arrangements for the kids. When she tried to meet in person, I refused. I couldn't bear to face her, not after everything that had happened. The hardest part was explaining the situation to our son. He had too many questions for which I had no easy answers. Why are we living with Grandma and Grandpa? When are we going home? He would ask, his young eyes filled with confusion and hurt. I did my best to be honest without giving him more than he could handle. Mom and I are working through some things, I told him. It's going to take time, but we're going to be okay. I promise. I threw myself into the routine of building a new life for us. I found a rental house on the other side of town, far from the neighborhood where Molly and I had lived. It wasn't much, just a small, 2-bedroom place, but it was ours. I set up the kids' rooms first, trying to make them feel as warm and welcoming as possible. The house felt empty and hollow, but it was a start. Slowly, I began to piece together a new normal. I kept the kids on a routine, focused on their well-being. I took on more work to cover the extra expenses, pouring myself into it as a way to keep the darkness at bay. Every day was a struggle, but I refused to let Molly's betrayal break me. One evening, as I sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Molly. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. I know I've lost you, and I don't deserve forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, truly. I've ruined everything, and I have to live with that. But please, for the sake of our family, let's find a way to co-parent peacefully. I stared at the message, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange kind of pity. She was right. She had ruined everything. But as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger forever, I knew it wasn't healthy. Not for me, not for the kids. I typed out a reply. We will co-parent, but that's all. My focus is on the kids and building a stable life for them. You made your choices, Molly, and now you have to live with them. I hit send and put the phone down, leaning back in the chair. The night air was cool, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a hint of peace settle over me. I had made it through the worst of the storm. And while the future was uncertain, I knew one thing: I had taken the first steps toward rebuilding my life. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. And I would do whatever it took to make it the best life possible for my kids and me. As I sat there, listening to the quiet rustle of the trees, I felt a sense of resolve. This was my new beginning, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The days turned into weeks, and life began to find a rhythm again. Our new house was modest but comfortable, and I worked hard to make it feel like home for the kids. I hung up their artwork on the walls, filled the shelves with their favorite books, and even put up some old family photos, ones that didn't include Molly. It wasn't perfect, but it was our space, and I was determined to make it feel safe. Our mornings became routine: breakfast, packing lunches, and getting the kids to school. Then it was off to work for me. I kept myself busy, picking up extra projects to help cover the new expenses. It wasn't easy balancing everything: work, the kids, dealing with the aftermath of what had happened, but keeping busy helped keep the darker thoughts at bay. Molly called every few days, usually under the pretense of checking in on the kids. She always wanted to talk to me, but I kept our conversations brief and strictly about logistics. She seemed to understand, at least on the surface, that things had changed permanently. The desperation in her voice was evident, though, every time we spoke. She was alone, living in the house we used to share, surrounded by the reminders of everything she had destroyed. My lawyer, Carol, had been working diligently on the custody arrangement. With the evidence of the affair and the fallout that followed, I had a strong case. One afternoon, I received a call from Carol's office. "Thomas, I have some news," she began, her tone professional but carrying a hint of optimism. "Molly's lawyer has proposed a settlement. Full custody to you with visitation rights for her. She seems willing to compromise, likely because of how public the situation has become." I felt a mixture of relief and an odd sense of finality. "And the house?" I asked, knowing it was one of the remaining sticking points. "She's agreed to sell it," Carol replied. "The proceeds will be split, which means you'll have enough to put down on a new home when you're ready." It was a step toward closure, but it felt bittersweet. The house had once been our dream, the place where we planned to raise our children and grow old together. Now, it was just another casualty of Molly's betrayal. All right, I said, exhaling slowly. Let's move forward with it. The days that followed were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. I knew there would still be difficult moments ahead, especially when it came to co-parenting with Molly. But having a plan in place, having that structure and security, gave me a new sense of control over our future. Molly had her first visitation with the kids on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I drove them over to the house, which felt surreal as I pulled into the driveway. It was like visiting a relic from another life. The kids were excited to see her, which was a good sign, but my son was also full of questions. "Are you going to come inside, Dad?" he asked as we parked. I shook my head gently. "No, buddy. I'll be back to pick you up in a couple of hours. You're going to have fun with Mom." He looked uncertain but nodded. I walked them to the door, giving Molly a brief, curt nod before turning and heading back to the car. She tried to catch my eye, but I avoided her gaze, focusing instead on making sure the kids were settled. When I returned later that afternoon, the kids seemed happy, though a bit confused. They had questions that I wasn't ready to answer in full. "Why aren't you and Mom living together anymore?" my son asked as we drove back to our new house. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, my heart aching. "It's complicated," I said softly. "But what's important is that Mom and I both love you very much. No matter what, that will never change." It was a partial truth, and I hated the vagueness of it, but I knew he wasn't old enough to understand the full story. For now, it would have to be enough. With the custody agreement settled, a sense of relief finally began to settle over our lives. I threw myself into creating new memories with the kids, filling our weekends with outings to the park, the zoo, and the occasional movie night. It was exhausting but rewarding. I watched as they slowly adapted to the new normal, their laughter and smiles becoming more frequent. Molly kept her visitations consistent, and while I remained distant, I couldn't deny that she was trying. She had clearly realized the gravity of her mistakes, but that didn't change what had happened. Trust was broken, and some things couldn't be repaired. The turning point came when I finally decided to look for a permanent home. With the settlement money from selling the old house, I had enough to put down on a new place. I wanted something fresh, a new start for the kids and me. After weeks of searching, I found a small, charming house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't as big or grand as our previous home, but it had character and enough space for us to grow into. More importantly, it was ours. When I took the kids to see the new house for the first time, they ran through the empty rooms, their laughter echoing off the walls. "This is going to be your new room," I told my son as we stood in a sunny bedroom overlooking the backyard. He grinned, his eyes shining with excitement. "It's perfect, Dad." My daughter tugged at my hand, pulling me toward another room. "What about this one? Is this mine?" I nodded, feeling a swell of pride and hope. "Yes, sweetheart, it's all yours." Seeing their joy brought a warmth to my chest that I hadn't felt in months. This was the start of our new life, the beginning of something better. I spent the next few weeks making the place feel like home, painting the walls, setting up the kids' rooms, and planting a small garden in the backyard. It was hard work, but it felt good, like a step toward reclaiming control over our future. Molly came by to see the kids on the first weekend after we moved in. She stood at the edge of the yard, watching them play on the new swing set I had built. I walked over, keeping my tone neutral. "They're adjusting well," I said, more as a statement than a conversation starter. She nodded, her eyes misting as she watched them. "You've done a great job, Thomas. They seem happy." I didn't respond, simply crossing my arms and staring out at the kids. There was an awkward silence before she spoke again. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to help, if you'll let me." I turned to her, finally meeting her eyes. They were filled with remorse, a sincerity that hadn't been there before. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the pain, the betrayal, and I knew that forgiveness would take time if it ever came at all. "You're their mother," I said finally. "You'll always be part of their lives. But we're doing this on my terms. You had your chance, Molly, and you blew it. Now, I'm focused on them and what they need." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I understand. I just want them to be happy." "So do I replied, turning back toward the house. "That's all that matters now." As she left, I watched the kids run around the yard, their laughter filling the air. This was our new beginning, a life built on resilience and the determination to move forward. I knew there would still be challenges, moments of pain and doubt, but I also knew that we had the strength to get through it. This was our life now, a different one than I had imagined, but one that I was ready to embrace fully. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was ours to walk. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of hope. Hope for the future and for the family I was rebuilding from the ashes of the past. Settling into our new life had brought a sense of normalcy. But that didn't mean the road was without bumps. The reality of single parenthood was a constant balancing act, juggling work, school, and the kids' emotional needs. The first few months in our new house were an adjustment period for all of us, filled with both triumphs and setbacks. I had gotten used to our routine. Mornings were a rush of breakfast, packing lunches, and driving the kids to school. Evenings were quieter, filled with homework, dinner, and bedtime stories. Yet, despite the calm on the surface, I could sense the lingering effects of the upheaval we'd gone through. My son, in particular, struggled with the new reality. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, questioning eyes. "Dad, why can't we live with Mom again?" His voice was soft, but the weight of his question hung heavily in the air. I took a deep breath, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "It's complicated, buddy. Your mom and I love you very much, but we can't live together right now. We're both trying to do what's best for you and your sister." He frowned, clearly not satisfied with my answer. "But I miss us all being together." "I know," I said, my heart clenching at his words. "I miss it too, sometimes." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "But things change. And sometimes when things change, we have to find a new way to be happy." He nodded slowly, his young mind processing what I was saying. "Does that mean you'll never get back together?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I don't know, buddy. But what I do know is that your mom and I will always be here for you, no matter what." It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the best I could give him. I kissed his forehead and tucked the blanket around him. "Good night, son. I love you." "Love you too, Dad," he murmured, turning over and clutching his pillow. As I left his room, I felt a mix of sadness and resolve. I knew this was only the beginning of difficult conversations to come. The kids would have questions, doubts, and feelings that I couldn't shield them from. But I also knew that we would navigate these challenges together, one step at a time. Molly continued her visitations, which were civil, though far from friendly. I kept her at arm's length, our interactions strictly about the kids. She seemed to accept this new dynamic, though I could see the strain in her eyes every time we exchanged a few words. It wasn't easy for her to live with the consequences of her actions. And it wasn't easy for me, learning to coexist with someone who had shattered my trust. As for Oliver, he had faded into the background, a ghost from a life that no longer belonged to us. Rumors floated around town about his attempts to rebuild his career elsewhere, but I paid them little mind. He was a part of the past that I was working hard to leave behind. One day, as I was picking up the kids from school, I noticed my son standing apart from his friends, his shoulders hunched. He climbed into the car without a word, staring out the window as I drove. My daughter chatted away in the backseat, blissfully unaware of her brother's silence. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked gently, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He shrugged, still not meeting my eyes. "Nothing. Doesn't look like nothing," I pressed, keeping my voice calm. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" He sighed, finally turning to face me. "Some kids at school were talking about Mom. They said she did something bad. And that's why you don't live together anymore." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I knew this day would come, but I wasn't ready for it. "What exactly did they say?" I asked carefully. "They said she cheated," he mumbled, looking down at his hands. "And that's why you guys split up." I swallowed hard, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Listen, what happened between your mom and me is complicated," I began, choosing my words with caution. "Yes, she made some mistakes. And it hurt us. But that doesn't mean she loves you any less." "Did she really cheat?" he asked, his eyes searching mine for the truth. I couldn't lie to him. He was old enough to sense when I was hiding something, and he deserved honesty, even if it was painful. "Yes, she did," I admitted, my voice strained. "But people make mistakes. It doesn't mean she's a bad person. It just means she made a bad choice." He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Is that why you can't be together?" I nodded. "It's part of it, yes. When someone breaks trust, it's really hard to go back to how things were before." He absorbed my words, his small face marked by a seriousness that no child should have to bear. "I wish things were different," he said quietly. "Me too," I replied, my heart breaking a little more. "But we're going to be okay, you and your sister and me. We're building a new life, one step at a time." The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat on the porch with a beer, staring up at the stars. The conversation had been a harsh reminder of the challenges we still faced, the wounds that hadn't yet healed. Molly called later that evening to check in. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button before I finally answered. "What is it, Molly?" I asked, my voice flat. "Thomas, I just wanted to talk about what happened with our son today. He mentioned it during our call, and I feel terrible," she said, her voice strained with guilt. "It was bound to happen," I replied, not bothering to mask my frustration. "Kids talk. They hear things." "I know," she sighed. I wish I could go back and change everything." "Well, you can't," I said bluntly. "All we can do now is deal with the consequences." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "I'm trying, Thomas. I really am. I want to be a good mother to them. You are their mother, and they need you," I admitted, feeling the bitterness ebb slightly. "But it's not about us anymore. It's about them. And they need stability, honesty, and love. That's what I'm focusing on." "I understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for still allowing me to be part of their lives." I didn't respond to that, ending the call with a curt goodnight. As I put the phone down, I realized that this was my new reality. I couldn't erase the past, but I could choose how to move forward. That night, I went to bed with a mixture of emotions swirling inside me: anger, sadness, but also a glimmer of hope. I had faced another hard truth with my son and handled it as best as I could. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Life would continue to test us, to push us in ways we weren't prepared for. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I reminded myself that I was stronger than I had given myself credit for. This was my path now, and I was ready to walk it, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. In the weeks that followed, I did my best to keep our household running smoothly. We settled into a comfortable routine. Weekdays were filled with school, work, and errands, while weekends became our sacred time to unwind and reconnect. But despite the semblance of normalcy, there was an undercurrent of tension. My son had grown quieter since our conversation about Molly's betrayal, and I could sense his struggle to process everything that had happened. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of our family vacations, holidays, and birthdays, memories that now felt like they belonged to another life. My thumb hovered over a photo of Molly and me from a few years ago. We looked happy and carefree, as if nothing could ever come between us. I quickly swiped past it, shoving those emotions back down. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, memories and what-ifs swirling in my head. I kept wondering if there had been something I could have done differently. Some sign I'd missed that might have saved us from falling apart. These thoughts crept in during quiet moments, gnawing at me, but I always pushed them away. The next morning, I woke up groggy and irritable. As I dragged myself to the kitchen, I found my son already sitting at the table, his cereal untouched. "Morning, bud," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "You're up early." He looked up at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "Dad, can I ask you something?" I took a seat across from him, setting my coffee down. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He fiddled with his spoon, staring down into his cereal. "Do you still love Mom?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I took a deep breath, trying to compose my thoughts. I care about your mom," I began carefully. "We spent a lot of years together, and we have you and your sister. So, in a way, yes, I will always have love for her. But sometimes, love isn't enough to fix what's broken." He nodded slowly, processing my words. "I just wish things could go back to how they used to be," he admitted, his voice small. "I know, buddy," I said softly, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "I wish that too, sometimes. But we can't change what's already happened. We can only move forward and try to make the best of what we have now." He gave a small nod and finally picked up his spoon, starting to eat his cereal. As I watched him, I realized how much he was growing up through all of this. It wasn't fair to him or to his sister, but life rarely played fair. All I could do was guide them through it, one step at a time. That day, as I drove to work, I felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. I was proud of my son for facing his emotions and asking the tough questions. But I was also painfully aware of the scars this experience would leave on him and his sister. It was a reminder that, despite the progress we'd made, there was still a long road ahead. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal. The kids and I spent more time outdoors, playing in the yard, taking trips to the park, and even planting flowers around our new house. I tried to make our home a place filled with warmth and laughter, hoping it would help heal the wounds that lingered beneath the surface. One Saturday morning, as we were working in the garden, my daughter ran over, her face flushed with excitement. "Dad, look, the flowers are blooming," she exclaimed, pointing to the small buds that had started to appear. I knelt down beside her, smiling at the sight. "They are, aren't they?" I replied. "It's amazing how a little bit of care and patience can make things grow." She nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. "Just like us?" I looked at her, taken aback by her words. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "Just like us." At that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we were starting to heal. It was in these small victories that I found the strength to keep moving forward. The kids were resilient, and I was learning to be, too. Later that afternoon, Molly arrived for her scheduled visitation. I watched from the porch as the kids ran to her, their excitement untainted by the complexities of our situation. She greeted them with open arms, her face lighting up as they chattered away about the flowers and their new routines. She approached me cautiously after a while, her gaze shifting from the ground to my face. "Thomas, can we talk?" she asked, her voice tentative. I sighed, folding my arms across my chest. "What is it, Molly?" She glanced over at the kids, making sure they were out of earshot. "I've been thinking about everything," she began. "I know I can't change what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to try to be a better parent for them, to be more involved in their lives." I studied her for a moment, looking for signs of sincerity. She seemed different, more grounded, less desperate than before. "They need you," I replied cautiously. "And I want them to have a relationship with you. But this isn't about us. It's about what's best for them." "I know," she said quickly. "That's why I'm asking if we can work together. For their sake. Co-parenting, I mean. They need both of us, and I want to do my part." I nodded slowly, digesting her words. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation, it was about being the parents our kids deserved. "All right," I said finally. "We can try. But it has to be on the same page. No more lies, no more games." "Agreed," she said, relief washing over her face. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this work for them." As I watched her walk back toward the kids, I felt a mixture of emotions, cautious optimism, lingering resentment, and a faint sense of relief. Co-parenting wasn't going to be easy, but it was a step in the right direction. The rest of the day passed without incident. I found myself watching from a distance as Molly played with the kids, her laughter blending with theirs. It was bittersweet to see them together, knowing that this was a glimpse of the life we once had. But it also reminded me of why I was doing this, to give our children the stability and love they needed to grow up whole. That evening, after Molly left, I tucked the kids into bed, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. We were navigating this new chapter, finding our way through the confusion and pain. It wasn't perfect, and there would be more hurdles to overcome, but for the first time in a while, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. As I sat on the porch, gazing out at the garden, I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs. The flowers were blooming, the kids were finding their smiles again. And I was slowly learning to let go of the anger that had gripped me for so long. This was our life now, a work in progress, a journey towards something new. And for the first time, I felt a small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. Co-parenting with Molly had been less chaotic than I initially feared, but it certainly wasn't easy. We agreed to communicate about the essentials, school events, medical appointments, and the kids' schedules. Everything else remained off limits. There were no friendly chats, no reminiscing about the past. I kept our interactions as matter of fact as possible, sticking to the boundaries I had set for my own sanity. One evening, Molly called to discuss our daughter's upcoming school project. "She needs some supplies," she began, her tone cautious. "I was thinking I could take her shopping tomorrow if that's okay with you?" "Fine," I replied curtly, glancing at the clock. "Just let me know what time you'll pick her up." Thank you, she said, and for a moment, I could hear the hesitation in her voice. Thomas, I just want to say, I appreciate you working with me on this. For the kids. I didn't respond immediately, my grip tightening on the phone. I knew she was trying to express some semblance of gratitude or regret, but I wasn't ready for any of that. I'm doing what's best for them, I replied coolly. That's all. A silence lingered between us, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. I understand, she finally said. I'll text you the details tomorrow. Good night. Good night, I replied, ending the call with a sigh. Setting the phone down, I stared at it for a moment, letting the emotions wash over me. This was a new reality: cordial exchanges, short conversations, and an ongoing effort to put the kids first. It was exhausting but necessary. Later that night, as I sat on the couch, I found my mind drifting to the life we once had. The spontaneous family outings, the laughter we used to share. It all seemed like a distant memory now, blurred and faded by the choices Molly had made. I knew I was right to set these boundaries, to protect myself and the kids. But every now and then, a part of me wondered if things could have been different. My thoughts were interrupted when my son wandered into the living room, his hair tousled from sleep. Dad, I had a bad dream, he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. I patted the spot next to me on the couch, and he climbed up, nestling against my side. What was it about, buddy? Monsters, he said, yawning. But not the kind you can see. The kind that hides. I felt a pang in my chest, recognizing the symbolism in his words. Well, you know what? I said, pulling him closer. Even the hidden monsters can't hurt you when you're safe here with me. He nodded, his eyes growing heavy. You'll always protect us, right? Always, I promised, kissing the top of his head. Now, let's get you back to bed. I carried him back to his room, tucking him in and sitting by his bedside until his breathing steadied, signaling he was fast asleep. As I walked back to my room, I reminded myself of that promise. No matter how challenging this new life was, I was determined to keep them safe and give them the best childhood I could. A few weeks later, the first real test of our co-parenting arrangement arrived, our daughter's school play. She had been talking about it for months, rehearsing her lines in the living room, and counting down the days until the performance. It was a big deal for her, and I wasn't going to let any lingering tension between Molly and me ruin it. The day of the play arrived, and I dressed the kids in their best clothes, snapping a few pictures before we left. My son grumbled about having to wear a tie, but I managed to convince him with a promise of ice cream afterward. As we headed to the school auditorium, I felt a knot form in my stomach. I knew Molly would be there, and while we had kept things civil for the kids, facing her in a public setting was a different challenge altogether. When we arrived, the auditorium was already buzzing with excitement. Parents milled about, finding their seats and greeting each other. I spotted Molly standing near the entrance, looking a bit lost. She caught my eye and gave a small, hesitant wave. I nodded in return, steering the kids toward our seats. The lights dimmed and the play began. Watching our daughter on stage, her face lit up with pride as she delivered her lines flawlessly, filled me with an overwhelming sense of joy. I glanced over at Molly and saw the same expression of pride on her face. In that brief moment, we shared something, an unspoken acknowledgement that, despite everything, we both loved our children fiercely. After the play, the kids ran up to us, their faces flushed with excitement. Did you see? Did you like it? Our daughter asked, bouncing on her toes. You were amazing, I said, scooping her into a hug. I'm so proud of you. You did great, sweetheart. Molly chimed in, giving her a hug as well. The kids beamed, soaking up our praise. As we stood there, the four of us together, it felt like a snapshot from our past, a fleeting glimpse of what used to be. It was bittersweet, reminding me of the family we once were. But as the kids chatted excitedly about the play, I knew that this was where we were now. Not the perfect family, but still a family, working through the broken pieces. Molly cleared her throat, catching my attention. I was thinking, maybe we could all go for ice cream? To celebrate? I hesitated, feeling the familiar tension rise in my chest. Part of me wanted to say no, to maintain the boundaries I had worked so hard to set. But then I looked at the kids, their faces shining with hope and excitement. This wasn't about me or Molly, it was about them. All right, I agreed, nodding. Ice cream it is, but just this once. The kids cheered, and Molly gave me a grateful smile. Thank you, she said quietly as we headed to the car. The ice cream shop was packed, the air filled with laughter and the clinking of spoons against glass bowls. We found a table in the corner, and for a moment, it felt almost normal. The kids chattered away, their sticky fingers reaching for napkins as they devoured their sundaes. Molly and I sat in relative silence, exchanging only a few words, but it was enough. The kids needed this. A moment where they could forget the tension and just enjoy being with both of their parents. As we left the shop, I felt a strange sense of calm. The outing hadn't been perfect, and I still had my reservations. But it was a step. A small, cautious step toward building a new kind of family dynamic. One that might not fit the traditional mold, but one that could work for us. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat on the porch and reflected on the day. It wasn't easy, facing the remnants of our past life while trying to move forward. But for the sake of our children, I was willing to keep trying. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't rewrite the history that had led us here. But I could choose to focus on what lay ahead, a future that, while uncertain, held the promise of new beginnings. A month had passed since the night of the school play and our unexpected ice cream outing. Life continued in its new rhythm, marked by the careful co-parenting arrangement Molly and I had agreed upon. Though we had managed to maintain a civil relationship, I still kept my distance. Trust, once broken, was not easily mended. One Friday evening, as I was preparing dinner for the kids, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Molly. "Can we talk? It's important." I frowned, wiping my hands on a dish towel before picking up the phone. The message seemed different from her usual communication, which typically revolved around the kids' schedules or logistics. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "What's it about?" A few seconds passed before she responded. "It's about us, and the future. I'd rather explain in person. Are you free tomorrow morning?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Sure," I typed back, keeping my reply short. "Tomorrow at 10, at the park?" "Okay, see you then," she replied. After sending the message, I tried to push aside the swirling thoughts and focused on dinner. I didn't want to jump to conclusions about what she wanted to talk about. Instead, I mentally prepared myself to hear whatever she had to say, knowing that this conversation could either help us move forward or drag up old wounds. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at my parents' house and drove to the park. It was one of those crisp, early spring days where the sun was bright but the air still held a lingering chill. I parked the car and walked to the bench where Molly was already sitting, her hands clasped in her lap. "Morning," I greeted, sitting down next to her but leaving a noticeable gap between us. "Morning," she replied, her eyes fixed on the playground in front of us. The park was quiet, with only a few families scattered about. It was almost symbolic of our lives, peaceful on the surface, but with a tension bubbling underneath. "So, what's this about?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. She took a deep breath, her fingers nervously twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her voice steady. "About everything that happened, about where we are now. And I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again, I'm sorry for what I did. I hurt you and the kids in ways I can't ever take back." I sat in silence, letting her words hang in the air. This was familiar territory, the apologies and the regrets. But what was different this time was her demeanor. She wasn't defensive or desperate. She seemed resolved. "I'm not saying this to ask for forgiveness or to try to fix things between us," she continued, glancing at me briefly. "I know that's not possible, and I accept that. But I want to move forward, to be better for the kids, and to finally let go of the past. I don't expect us to be friends, but I hope we can work together to give them the stability they need." I nodded, appreciating the honesty in her words. "That's what I want too," I replied. "The kids need both of us, even if we're not together." "But I'll be honest, Molly. Trust is a hard thing to rebuild. I'm not there yet, and I don't know if I ever will be." "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I know I have to earn that if it's even possible. I needed you to know where I stand. I'm not the same person I was when all this happened, and I'm trying to be better for them." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. She did seem different, more grounded, less like the woman who had thrown our lives into chaos with her choices. There was still pain and resentment inside me, but there was also a part of me that recognized her growth. "Okay," I said finally, exhaling slowly. Let's focus on the kids, on giving them the best life we can. That's all we can do now." A small, relieved smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for me either, but I'm committed to making this work." For them. We sat in silence for a while, watching as a young couple played with their child in the sandbox. It reminded me of when our kids were younger, when life felt simpler. Those memories no longer brought a sharp sting of pain, but rather a bittersweet nostalgia. It was a sign, I realized, that maybe I was starting to heal. As we wrapped up the conversation, I felt a strange sense of closure. Molly and I would never go back to what we were, but we could redefine our relationship for the sake of our children. It wasn't about forgiving or forgetting. It was about acknowledging the past and choosing to move forward. We parted ways with a brief, awkward wave. As I walked back to the car, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This conversation had marked a turning point, a new chapter where I no longer needed to carry the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. Molly and I had a long road ahead as co-parents. But for the first time, I felt like we might actually make it work. Driving back to my parents' house, I thought about how far we had come. The journey hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more challenges to face. But I also knew that I was stronger now, more capable of handling whatever came next. And that strength wasn't just for me, it was for my kids, for the life I was building with them. When I arrived to pick up the kids, they ran toward me, their laughter filling the air. I scooped them up in a big hug, holding them close. They were my anchor, my reason for pushing through the pain and striving for a better future. And as I looked at their smiling faces, I knew that we were going to be okay. Not perfect, but okay. And for now, that was more than enough. Months passed, and with each day, the chaos of the past slowly began to settle into something resembling normalcy. My life with the kids took on a familiar rhythm: school drop-offs, soccer practices, and the endless cycle of homework and dinner routines. There was a strange comfort in the predictability of it all. It was far from the life I had envisioned when Molly and I first married, but it was the life I had now, and I was learning to embrace it. One Saturday morning, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee while the kids played in the living room. The sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. It was a peaceful moment, the kind I had come to appreciate more than I used to. The silence was broken when my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Molly. "Can we talk about summer plans for the kids?" I set down my coffee and replied, "Sure. When do you want to meet?" "Later today, if you're free," she responded. I glanced at the kids, who were engrossed in their game. This was a conversation that needed to happen, so I agreed. "Okay, let's meet at the coffee shop around 2. The afternoon came, and I found myself sitting at a small table in our local cafe, nursing a cup of black coffee. Molly arrived shortly after, offering a polite smile as she took the seat across from me. "Thanks for meeting," she began, pulling out a small notebook. "I've been thinking about the kids' summer, and I wanted to see what your thoughts were on camps, vacations, that sort of thing." I nodded, appreciating that she had come prepared. "I was thinking we could keep them busy with some activities, maybe sports camp or a science program. They've been talking about wanting to try new things." She made a note in her book, her face thoughtful. "I was also considering a short trip, maybe to the lake. I know they've been asking to go fishing." A pang of nostalgia hit me. We used to go to the lake every summer as a family. But I pushed those memories aside, focusing on the present. "That could work," I replied. "We'd just have to coordinate dates. I can take them one weekend, and you can take them another." "Right," she said, nodding. "I think that's a good idea." As we talked, I realized something had shifted between us. The tension that had once dominated our conversations was gone, replaced by a kind of calm understanding. We were no longer fighting each other. We were working together, and it felt different. We discussed the details of the summer schedule, agreeing on camps, trips, and weekends. For once, it was a straightforward conversation with no underlying conflict or emotional landmines. When we finished, Molly looked up from her notebook, her eyes meeting mine. "I know things have been hard," she said, her voice steady. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work for the kids. I've made mistakes, and I've learned from them. I'm grateful we can do this." I studied her for a moment, seeing the sincerity in her expression. There was no need for grand statements of forgiveness or closure, we both knew the wounds ran deep. But in that moment, I recognized that we had come to an unspoken agreement: A truce of sorts, for the sake of the children. I appreciate that, I replied simply. We're doing what's best for them, and that's what matters. She nodded, a small, relieved smile crossing her face. Exactly. We wrapped up our conversation, agreeing to stay in touch about the final plans. As I stood up to leave, I felt a sense of clarity. This was our new reality, two parents who had once shared everything, now navigating separate lives but still united in their love for their kids. It wasn't what I had ever imagined, but it was a reality I could accept. Back home, I found the kids still playing in the living room. I sat down on the couch, watching them for a moment. They were the constant in all of this, the reason I had pushed through the hurt and anger. And looking at them now, I felt a sense of pride. They had been through so much, yet they were still full of joy and energy. My daughter noticed me watching and came over, climbing onto the couch next to me. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" "Just about summer," I said, wrapping an arm around her. "We've got some fun plans coming up. Are we going to the lake?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. I smiled. "Yeah, we're going to the lake. We'll go fishing, and maybe even camp out for a night." "Yay," she cheered, running off to tell her brother the news. As I watched them, I felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, co-parenting would always come with its challenges. But for the first time, I felt like we were all starting to move forward. Molly and I had our boundaries. And the kids had the stability they needed. That was enough for now. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the sunny day. Life had thrown me a curveball, shattered my expectations, and forced me to rebuild from the ground up. But I had come out stronger on the other side. I had learned to let go of the past, to focus on what truly mattered, my children, my own growth, and the life I was creating for us. With that thought in mind, I turned back to the living room where the kids were planning their imaginary fishing trip. I joined them, knowing that this was where I was meant to be, not in the past, not in regrets, but here, in the present, building a new life one day at a time. And as I laughed along with them, I realized that we were going to be okay. Maybe even better than okay. We were moving forward, and that was a victory in itself.